Today we're going to make a North Mountain Supply traditional mead.
Now, why are we calling it North Mountain Supply Traditional Mead? Well, because North Mountain Supply has honey now.
That's right.
And it's not just any honey. This honey actually was documented on a television show where they were talking about the quality of honey.
I think it's the supplier, not this exact honey. They supply several honeys, but that supplier, they were like one of the best you can get.
Yeah.
So
we're pretty excited about
this. And since we partner with North Mountain Supply, we've been in touch. We do monthly meetings, and there's a lot of things that they have planned, and we've been giving them a lot of input for different things, and one of them was getting honey. And I can't quote the exact price because I don't know it off the top of my head, but I do know that it's going to be very, very competitive with most of the other honeys that you can get from Amazon. And they're going to come in 3-pound and... Where's the other one? The big giant one, a 12-pound or a 1 gallon size. So they're going to have that. Right now, this is the style of honey. It is just raw and unfiltered honey. But they are going to be offering different things too. But we're going to make a mead with it, because that's what I like to do anytime I get a new honey. And they sent us a bunch of this to try out. So first thing I want to do is make a traditional. Now, a traditional just means minimal extras. Okay, so for this one, we're going to do minimal extras. But wait, before I get started on that, there's something I want to do first. All right. First, I want to actually hydrate my yeast. And what yeast are we using and why, Derica?
We're using this one.
Yeah?
That I pronounced
Premier
wrong.
Cote de Blanc.
I pronounced it wrong.
By Red Star. But it's also by Fermentis. There's a reason why we're using a Fermentis yeast. It's because North Mountain Supply has an association and an affiliation with Fermentis. And we just might be going there. More on that in a few weeks. But we're going to use that yeast because it goes with North Mountain Supply. So this is very much so a North Mountain Supply mead.
Are you doing half a packet or full packet?
I'm doing half a packet.
Okay.
Roughly. I mean, I'm not going to measure it. Okay, that's about half packet. My rule of thumb for yeast is up to 3 gallons, use half packet. More than 3 gallons, use a whole packet. If you're making 3 gallons exactly, you can go either way. It doesn't really matter. And we're just going to pour some water into that. Not a lot, a few ounces. Okay, that's good. That's good. And just kind of give it a little mixy mix.
He likes mixing it. I don't know why, because it just makes a big mess.
Nope. See, that time it was better.
It was... Okay.
It's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And we'll do that for proof of life. You don't actually have to, but this way we know if it's alive or DOA.
Now, we've kind of jumped the gun here.
How's that?
What is missing on this table?
There's no scale.
Well, we don't need that because we know we have knowledge. We don't have a piece of paper. We're not taking notes.
Oh boy, we'll have to write that down after.
I want to get it now.
Oh, okay. All right. I have paper to make a note. So let's start putting this mead together. This is actually going to be a pretty simple mead. Get our honey open.
Now, the reason why Brian said we don't have a scale and I said we don't need one is because we're going to use the full 3 pounds of this honey that has already been measured.
We're going to trust that it's actually 3 pounds. It is sealed for your protection and everyone else's. That was a hard one to get off. I'm just going to dump it in. We did not warm this up or anything. We probably should have, but don't worry. It's okay. That's some seriously thick honey, too. Oh, this is going to take a little while. So one thing that we didn't really talk about much so far is sanitation. And it's really important to sanitize all of your gear and everything that comes in contact with your mead. And the tool that we use to sanitize is...
the red bucket of sanitization!
Which is literally just a 15-gallon bucket, just off camera, filled with Star San and water to the manufacturer's suggestion. And we just dip everything in there. They'll sit in there for what, like 2 minutes, I think it is? Mm-hmm. And everything gets clean. That way, you know, no stuff lives in our mead that we don't want living in our mead until we want something living in our mead.
If you are unable to get Star San in your particular area, if you can find a baby sanitizer, baby bottle sanitizer.
Milton's in England is
that seems to work really well as well.
And I just added some warm water to our honey bottle.
You're getting water everywhere.
Am I really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh. They leak. And I'm just going to pour it in. get some of that honey off the funnel. You know, if I don't make a mess, it's just not a CSB video. That's just how it is. All right. There, now I'm not spraying water everywhere anymore. So we did actually get warm water instead of just standard tap water. This is filtered water, by the way. And it's about a little over 96 ounces is what we used from the beginning. I have a couple ounces here, probably a good half an ounce on the table. And the rest we're going to be putting into here. Most likely, almost all of it. 3 pounds of honey is roughly a quart. It's actually like 33 ounces, I think. So we have roughly a 1-to-3 ratio of water to honey, or honey to water, if you're into that sort of thing. So now I'm just going to pour some of our water in here because we want to start mixing this honey up. Now, you don't technically have to mix it because the yeast will get to it, but it's a good idea. It lets us see, did we mistakenly add more honey than we needed? It's happened. People have told me that. Or did we, I don't know. There's other reasons.
It allows you to oxygenate the brew, which is what Brian is about to do.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, and it didn't come out that way.
And the reason why you oxygenate the brew is so that oxygen is in your must, so the yeast can consume that, be fruitful, and multiply.
Yeah, in the first phase of their productivity, where they're building a colony, they need oxygen in order to build that colony. After they've done that and consumed all the oxygen, that's when they start producing alcohol. So you want a good, strong colony to be built before then, so you want some oxygen in it.
So oxygen before alcohol is present is a good idea. Oxygen after alcohol present is a bad idea because alcohol plus oxygen plus acetobacters, which are omnipresent, can create vinegar.
Right. Yeah, acetobacter is already there, just like there's yeast in the honey too. But we do use a commercial yeast because it's a little stronger and more reliable. But this honey should definitely have wild yeast in it because it's raw, unpasteurized honey. It's got an amazing color too. Look at that. Usually it's a lot lighter when I start mixing it. That's pretty incredible. It's going to hiss at me.
I would not be surprised if our gravity reading is a little stronger on the sugar wise because of the way it was so thick when it poured. Tells me that potentially it has less water in the honey than some other honeys we may have
I hope
had in the
not,
past.
because I measured this out to be just right. What I mean by that is Cote Blanc is a 14% or so alcohol tolerance yeast. So, I mean, we all know yeast can't read, but they're also, made to do that. So they're going to be right around that number. And, well, we have enough honey in here to make about 13 to 14%. So it might end a little bit on the sweet side, it might end kind of dry. We're not sure yet, but that's mixed pretty good. Rule of thumb when mixing. Mix till you think you're done, go for 2 more minutes. I'm calling that 2 more minutes. All right. So now I want to add more of our water in.
Is that funnel just getting in your way?
Yeah, it's just in my way now.
All right. I can make it.
It's clean though.
I can make it go.
Okay. I'm going to add more in. And I don't want to get too greedy because I do have a couple ounces of water with our yeast still, but I know that this should make a gallon. And by the way, people ask all the time, what if I want to make 2 gallons? Well, just double everything except the yeast. 3 gallons, triple everything except the yeast. But you could double the yeast at that point. 4 gallons, 5 gallons, obviously 4 or 5 times, and then you definitely double the yeast. Because remember the rule about yeast. Now at this point, I have a double-edged sword. I have 2 things going on here. If I fill this all the way to the top, you see all that foam? That can work its way up into the airlock during fermentation and make a mess. But if I don't get enough water in there, my honey dilution rate isn't as high. So I may end up with too high of a solution. So, make sense? All right, so a couple of additions that we want to do. I normally like a little bit of a tannic feel to my meads. So we're going to add some North Mountain wine tannin. We'll have links to all this stuff in the description of this video too. And it says about 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon per gallon. I know from past usage that 1/2 teaspoon does a really good job. And this is basically just essence of oak is what it really is. It's like probably powdered oak, like from what you'd use to oak something like in a barrel or something like that. And I just drop it right in Try not to hit the sides because, you know, it just makes a mess. Washed off the measuring spoon. Now it's wet, so I have to be very careful before I do the next thing. But a little bit about the warm water, by the way, too. It's warm as in it was about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just slightly above blood temperature. Any more than that, and you're very likely to have a problem. Yeast don't like things much higher than that. So try to keep it around there. And I use the term blood temperature because when I used to say room temperature, our room temperature is different than your room temperature, but our blood temperatures are probably within a couple of degrees. At least I hope so. If not, see a doctor. And this is Fermade O. It is an organic yeast nutrient because if you've watched the show at all, or if you've made mead before, you know that honey doesn't really contain a lot of nutrients that the yeast needs in order to be fruitful and multiply and grow and properly consume all the sugars here and make us mead. So they could produce off flavors, they could stall, which means it doesn't fully ferment, or any number of other things can happen, and we don't want that. All right, our yeast is bubbling. There's a little bit of bubbles in the liquid, and they're not just like sitting at the bottom. If they just like drop to the bottom and the water stays clear, they're probably dead, which means just get another packet of yeast, dump it in there. They will cannibalize each other, and the better yeast will win, I guess. So I'm just going to kind of get these up into suspension here. By the way, this method makes a very simple traditional mead, but I actually really like it. Just super easy, super simple. It highlights the honey choice that you made. So if you use a really simple honey, it's going to be a little simpler of a mead. If you use a more exotic honey, it's going to be a more exotic of a mead.
Are you happy with that volume, or do you want to add any more water?
I'm probably going to add more water because there's still more. And I don't want, too high of a gravity here. But I think just a little more. That's it. I know I put in more water than I had. And now I want to give this one last mix, but I don't want to get all that stuff stuck to the sides and the yeast and everything. So I'm just going to kind of swish it around, swirl it around. There we go.
You still want to try to make sure that it's getting all thoroughly mixed, because otherwise your gravity reading might not be accurate.
Right. Yep. It'll still ferment, it'll still work, but your original gravity might be a little bit off. So that's all mixed through. Don't worry about the wine tannin sitting in clumps or anything. It'll break up. It's fine. So what we're going to do now is take a specific gravity reading. For that, I'm using a hydrometer and a baster, because the baster is just the easiest way to get the liquid out of there. I call it a poor man's wine thief. You can use any number of devices to get the liquid out. We also sanitized all this stuff so the sample can go back in. If you don't sanitize these first, well, I don't know why you wouldn't. But if you didn't, then the sample cannot go back in. And right now it's just sugar water, so I'm not sure I'd really want to drink it all that much. I'm expecting this to be around 1.100 to 1.110, something in that range. 1.102. Now, you might be wondering, what does that even mean? That is the specific gravity. That's the ratio of the density of the sugars to water. And if you look at a lot of your hydrometers, they have a potential alcohol scale. So I can go on this and look at it and say, oh, look at that. 10, 11, 12, 13, a little over 13% alcohol. Okay, so that means it could be anywhere from like 12 to 14. That's cool, because our yeast, in theory, will stop at 14. And now, one last thing that I want to do before we set this to go is I like to take pH readings. We've started doing that in recent times, and it's proven to be very useful, because if the pH or acidity of your must is way off, well, a couple things can happen. The first is if it's too high, and this is a rarity, but it is possible that you could get botulism to grow in it. And by too high, I mean above 4.6. So this is very, very green. But it's not in the bad range. It's between 4 and 4.5. Yeah. I aim for 4. But if I'm at like 3.6, 3.7, I'm good. If I'm at like 4.3, 4.4, I'm good. This is dead smack right in the middle. It's probably closer to 4.5. It's in a good spot. It's fine. It's not higher than that. And if it goes lower, like too low, below 3.5 or like 3, that's when some yeast will say, nope, not going to work. And they could even die.
Now, we know that the fermentation process itself is an acidifying process.
Yes, it is.
So this is going to go lower on the pH, thus more acidic, during the process of fermentation.
But that's a good thing because as the mead is finishing, you want to be able to preserve it. And a higher level of acid or a lower pH gives it more preservative power. That way, you could just leave it on the shelf for a couple of years and it'll be fine. But what do we need now?
We need an airlock and a bung.
Yes, we do. Okay, this is an airlock and this is a bung. When you apply an airlock, and this one might work, we might need a rubber band to hold it in place. I don't know. Some of our bungs are a little bit larger than they need to be.
So we had foam and gunk all up in there.
If it's dry, it goes in a lot easier.
It does.
But let's just go over what an airlock does. An airlock basically is there to keep bugs out and to let gases escape during fermentation. During fermentation, this is going to create a lot of gas and ethanol, which is what you really want. But those gases, if trapped in here, will make a bomb. So don't just put a cap on this. Don't screw it down. Don't do that. Use an airlock. Trust me, you'll be happy. You can use a blow-off tube, which is actually just a bung with a piece of tubing going into like a mason jar or some other vessel. Yeah, that's the word. Filled with sanitizer fluid right from turbos or something. That also is an airlock. It's totally fine to use. Please use that before you go using like leave the lid loose or something. Please don't do that. It's just not a good idea. But anyway, the way an airlock works is the gases come out. They go up this side. They go down this side, this side. They push all that liquid in the airlock to the other side, and then they bubble out through the airlock. And that's exactly what it does. It kind of works similar to the trap in a sink, but it's all actually the opposite way of working. But regardless, that's what it does. So fermentation can take anywhere from a week or two to 5, 6, 7 weeks sometimes. It depends on your temperature, it depends on your must, how strong it was, it depends on the yeast you used. There's a lot of factors involved. So don't get caught up in how long it takes. In our environment, using this yeast, using this recipe, it's probably going to be anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks for us. But yours could be longer, yours could be quicker. It's okay.
Now, because we have a decent amount of foam in there, and we've never fermented with this honey before, we are going to place this on a lipped tray, just a cookie tray that has edges. So that way, if it does get a really excited fermentation and all that foam comes pouring out of our airlock, which can happen, and it's not something to freak out about, It's just messy. So it'll be trapped, the mess, in that tray.
Now, some other things about the airlock. If it does get up into the airlock, all you have to do is remove the airlock, clean it out, and put it back. That's it. Now, if it happens too often and you just don't want to clean it out all the time, remember the blow-off tube that I was talking about? Do that, because that's a much easier way to not have to clean it out every 20 minutes.
What do you refill your airlock with when you clean it out, Brian?
Well, you can refill it with Star San solution, or you can use any cheap spirit or, well, expensive spirit, I guess, if you really wanted to. I prefer Scoresby Scotch because I actually just don't like to drink it. Someone asked today, does it matter what spirits you use? It really doesn't, but if you had to choose, like the best one's probably going to be a vodka because it's the most neutral. Just in case there was suck back and some of it got into your brew, it had the least impact. But trust me, the small amounts that are in there, it's not going to affect it anyway.
The only time it really will create a vacuum is if there's a vast difference in temperature in your house during the day or night. If it changes drastically, then it could create a bit of a vacuum and reverse the suction.
Right. People also ask, what's the best temperature? Well, that really depends on your environment. We don't alter our environment for brewing. We alter our brewing for our environment. Very different thing. Some yeasts work really well in our environment, which runs 72 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit. We happen to be in Florida. But I know other people that are in much cooler temperatures, they will use different yeasts. Like, for instance, here's a perfect example. Lalvin 71B is one of my favorite yeasts. D47 is kind of its counterpart, but for colder temperatures. So if you're in a warm temperature like 70 or up, you want to use 71B. If you're below 70, D47 is probably going to work better for you. They're similar, not quite the same, but they're similar enough. But that kind of gives a counterpart. Another example is like EC1118. In our environment, it really doesn't work that well. But in a lot of places, it's a champagne yeast that's super powerful. People love it because they're fermenting in the 60s instead of the 70s for temperature, and they get great results with it. So, okay, but now what are we going to do with this?
We're going to let it sit.
And we'll see when it's done. It's been 3 weeks, and I'm gonna say it's not done. Let me show you what this looks like inside. So as you can see, there's still bubbles coming up the side. Not as many as on some that we've seen, but there are a few. And if we move up into the airlock, you can see it's still moving. I mean, there's gonna be a bubble any second now. And there you go. Now, the bubble in the airlock doesn't mean as much to me as those little tiny bubbles coming up the side. But even those little bubbles coming up the side can fool you. They can actually just be off-gassing, coming off of the particulates sitting in the bottom. So the only way to know is, gotta take a reading. For that, we're gonna use a hydrometer, just like we did when we took the original reading. By the way, if you see me do this, what I'm doing is getting some of the star sand solution out of this so it doesn't throw off our reading. Obviously, there's a tiny, tiny amount of star sand still in there. Nothing's perfect. It's better to just not worry about it. It's kind of like when you're watching sci-fi, just suspend your disbelief. Close enough is close enough. That's kind of the rule of thumb that I'm starting to come to when it comes to these things. Oh, wow, that fermented quite well. I don't think it's completely done yet, but it's really close. It's at, there's some gassiness going on here, but I'm going to call that 1.008. The gassiness can throw it off by a couple points. I'm not going to worry too much because it's not done yet. Now, what does that mean? It's been going for a couple weeks. It just needs a little bit more time. We've had that happen a lot recently where things are just taking a little bit longer. We used Coq de Blanc yeast for this one. Usually a pretty good performer. We've not had much problems with that. And we sanitized everything, so that's why I can dump this back in. And I'm going to give it a swirl, which just means creating a vortex. I'm cleaning off some of the croissant that just wants to come loose. I'm degassing it a little bit, and I'm getting some of the lees cake off the bottom. That way, if there's anything that the yeast can use that's in there, or any live yeast that are just kind of hanging out and on vacation, they get back to work. Maybe we can get those last points used up. Because to me, this isn't done. 1.102 to 1.008 with that yeast, it's not done. It's still got a little bit to go. Not a lot. And if you really liked it now, if you wanted to, you could rack this off, taste it. If it tastes good, pasteurize it. Now you don't even have to worry about it. We're going to let it run its course, do the whole thing, but that is certainly a way to go. Pretty gassy stuff. So yeah, I could degas that for like an hour if I really wanted to. Instead, we're going to put that airlock back on, stick our note back on, put it in the ferment station, see you in a week. All right, it's been one more week, and it looks like this one's pretty much done-ish.
And we still have very little...
Oh, there are.
Little tiny baby bubbles coming up, and we have a little bit of a bubble layer at the top.
Yeah.
Which is telling me...
Maybe not.
Probably not done yet. It's not clearing yet, which is another reason that makes me think...
It's starting to clear. That's not...
Probably not done yet, but we will see.
It was at 1.008, so
we're just guessing right now.
It was at 1.008, so it's probably not that far off. 1.002. Now, I know some people might say, oh, that's close enough to being dry or being done. But it's really not, because I'm expecting this to be somewhere around like 13%, which means it can go down to as low as 0.790 or something like that.
That's a lot of points.
Yeah, that's a lot further down. That's 22 more points than what it is. So there's a lot of leeway here. I just wanted to give that a quick spin just to make sure I wasn't wrong. Yeah. The amount of carbonation didn't seem to have much effect. I'm not going to say this is done yet. I don't think it's done.
I don't feel like it's done.
So I'm just going to pour this back in carefully-ish so that I don't splash. I'm going to put the airlock back on. Before we put the airlock on, I'm going to give this a swirl. And the swirl is creating a vortex in the middle.
It's going to degas, and it's going to bring up those things that may have settled to the bottom that may still be active back into solution so they can get back to work.
That's right. Now we're going to put the airlock back on it. Stick it in a ferment station for probably 2 weeks because we're going to be out of the country, so we won't have a chance to check it. That's why we checked this one today. We could have waited and just let it go, but now we know it's at 1.002. It's very, very close to probably hitting that equilibrium point.
Sort of.
I don't like to say done as much as I like to say this one will hit an equilibrium.
It'll be done when it's done.
Exactly. So we'll see you then. It's been 2 weeks and 2 days since we looked at this last, and I'll apologize right now. I might sound a little bit stuffy because we went on a trip and I came back and got sick, and I'm still sick. Anyway, when last we looked at this, it was 1.002. So we need to find out, where is it now? Is it done yet? Are we there yet?
We certainly hope so.
I mean, we started this like 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago now. You know,
I would like to say this is the only one that's taken its time, but we actually have a whole rack of brews that have decided to just take their time. And maybe they knew we were going to go on a trip.
Maybe.
And so they're like, you know what? We have time.
Well, now we're back, so they can hurry up and get done. And this just goes to prove that you never know how long it's really going to take. We hear people say, oh, I let it sit for 12 days and then I rack it. Well, that's not necessarily a good plan every time. You want to go with what the brew says to do.
Looks like we're at 1.000.
It would appear so, except that it's 1.002 again. It's the meniscus. You gotta see, it's going up to.
I'm looking at a weird angle.
It's 1.002. So it's done.
It's done.
Also, I don't know if you'll hear it, but there is a major rainstorm happening outside right now. So, noise removal will probably get rid of it, and the microphone might not even pick it up.
Also, if for some reason this particular edit just goes bleep, it's because their power went out.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't see that, though.
Well, it would stop, and then we'd be in different clothes and
Except that we're on battery power.
Oh.
Except for the lights. It'll go dark. But the camera's on battery.
We'll film by candlelight. Sure. Why not?
And we're going to rack this now because it's done. So I'm just going to pour the sample into this pitcher. And the reason we do that is because if I pour it directly into here, it's just going to mess up all the lees.
Yeah, see how you probably can see from there, we have a decent amount of lees. Not a tremendous amount, but
I could show them.
Oh, we have the technology. All right, so you can see here at the bottom, this darker section, that is our lees cake. It's nicely compacted, and we hope it remains so when we rack. If we scoot all the way up to the top, we can still see a fine bit of foamy foam, but I think that's just residual. That's not, because I'm not seeing any additional bubbles coming up. And at the very top here, we have our croissant. That gunk is normal. That's part of the process, so don't worry about it. And the reason why I pointed those different things out is because we have a lot of commenters that freak out about this stuff. And if it's your first time brewing and you see that up there,
yeah, you might be like, what the heck?
I'd freak out too. But that's just proteins from all that foam. Remember the very beginning that built up? When the bubbles popped, it stuck to the side and just dried out, and that's what it looks like.
Yeah, no big deal. So now we're going to rack this from here to here. And racking just literally means moving it from one vessel to another. And for that, we're going to use an auto siphon. We have videos on that, so we're going to be back in 2 seconds after it's been racked. All right, so now that we have it racked, we're going to just take a quick little sample and take a taste of it. That way we can get a feel for what it's like. This is the first time we've actually tasted this one.
This is. And I want to talk a little bit about that 1.002 ending gravity. Because we did our normal process of checking and then rechecking until we got those two numbers that matched, this is stable in this form, but more than likely we're going to go beyond this form. And so we intend to backsweeten this. Now, we're going to taste it first to see if it's necessary, but beyond that, we're going to be doing some other things. We'll talk about that later.
Definitely needs sweetening.
It has a lot of youth on the aroma.
Yeah. I also need to really rinse my mouth. I took some medication just a little bit ago. I think it's messing with my taste.
Right. Also, our tastes might be a little whack right now. And that happens, I'm getting some citrusy and fruity notes on it.
Okay. Need a little bit more for science.
But I would definitely want to bump up the sweetness level. Since this is a traditional mead.
I gotta admit, it's tasting a little harsh.
Yeah.
Like, beyond just being young, we use Cote de Blanc yeast. We did add wine tannin to this.
Yeah, I'm feeling the tannin.
Tannin's strong. No problem with the tannin. We use fermentation. Started at 1.102 gravity and it ended at 1.002, which means it burned through 100 points, which if you just go by the standard 131.25 for calculation, it's about 13% or so, which means it's anywhere from like 12 to 14.
Yep.
It's in the range of what Cote de Blanc could do.
Yep.
Wow, it just feels a little harsher than I expected. So we're going to add some honey to it. Now, time may help that. It is possible that the yeast were stressed somehow. Not really sure how, since we did use all the proper things, but it could happen. Our way of sweetening is add it until it's sweet enough for you. So how much do I start with?
To taste.
Yeah. So how much do I start with? Well, since we know it was pretty dry, I started with probably a 1/4 pound to almost a 1/2 pound. We're probably going to end up at like a 1.020 or so final gravity. But don't count on that yet, because I'd rather go by taste than the numbers.
Sure. So for you might like things sweeter or drier than we do, and so follow our methods and sweeten it to the level that suits you.
I think this actually tastes quite acidic, is what I'm getting
does.
too. We might have to take a pH reading just to get an idea. The citrusy notes.
The citrusy notes.
Yeah, that's what made me think of that.
Yeah.
We might take a pH reading just for science, just for the record, you know? Because we know that as it ferments, it goes down at pH. We didn't even take a pH reading on this one in the beginning. It's okay.
That's fine. We actually learned a lot about the fermentation process on our trip. It solidified many of the practices that we've already used, and it answered some of the few gaps that we had where we knew there was a correlation, but we weren't exactly what it was. Mm-hmm. And so that was really cool. That was nice to know. Yeah,
speaking of the trip, we went to Belgium and France to visit with Fermentis, which is the yeast company. And we got to be around the Fermentis people, got to meet several of them, got to sit in on some classes. It was mostly aimed at commercial wine and beer makers, but there was still quite a bit for us to gather from it. So It was actually pretty interesting.
Yeah. It was also nice to see the overlay of our practice as a home brewer versus the practices that are in usage for commercial, and how it's basically the same process, just on a larger scale.
Yeah. All right, so that's with first edition of honey in there. That smell, though, it smells very young.
It smells super young. Yeah.
That helps. Still needs a lot more. Now, it is possible, like she said, that our palates are just totally off today. Because I'm still quite sick. She's getting over it, but probably still a little.
I'm getting the tactile sensation of honey now, but I still think it could use some more sweetness.
Okie dokie. More sweetness. Sweetness. It is rare that I say something is too sweet for me, so I don't have a problem with that. I have said it, but it is kind of rare. I don't say it very often. Plus, there's this idea in a lot of people's head that mead is supposed to be sweet, which is kind of true, but not. It's supposed to be is the part that I have a disagreement with.
Yeah.
Was it often served sweet back in the day? I believe so. Because they probably didn't let it sit and ferment until it was done. They let it go until they wanted to drink it, and then they drank it. So they were probably drinking partially fermented or still fermenting mead a lot of the time. Of course,
our understanding of back in the day, there really weren't great records kept, so it's mostly conjecture. But we know...
The fact that they called it nectar of the gods, though, makes me think it was probably sweet.
Yeah, and it's our understanding that a lot of the things that they added to their vat o mead were things that were a little past their prime, and they didn't want to waste them, so they knew that from experience, the alcohol and the honey preserved those things so they could still use them.
Yep.
So I think adding additional sweetness to those less than perfect ingredients would probably help the palate.
Well, it's funny because some of those less than perfect ingredients were added to mask the flavors of the mead itself if it was kind of dry or, off because of fusels or stressed yeast. And then they would probably add more honey to it just to make it sweet to cover up the flavors of those things. So it was all just a big cover up. It's really what mead was. That's one way to look at it, okay? There's a lot of different understandings of it. And I think people that made it, try to do it professionally or commercially back then probably had a better understanding, whereas people that made it in their house themselves maybe didn't always, but they weren't going to waste whatever they made either. So they just kept adding to it and adding to it and adding to it until they liked it or could tolerate it, and then they got drunk.
Again, this is all guesswork.
It's conjecture.
And based on the few amounts of evidence that can be found.
Yep. More honey smell now. It's still really harsh. Okay, that brings it to a more or less a tolerable level to me. Mm-hmm. I think if we were to sweeten this further, we might, after some of that stuff mellows, have a too sweet mead.
I would like to sweeten it just a little bit more.
Okay.
And this is my reasoning for that. I know we're going to pasteurize this next.
Yeah.
And sometimes pasteurization brings the sweetness down a little bit when it mellows things out. Yeah. So
Okay.
if you could just do a skosh more.
All right.
The exact measurement of a skosh is that much.
I highly doubt you're going to be able to even detect that.
It's okay. It makes me feel better.
That's why I did it, because it made you feel better. And when you feel better, I feel better. So, go team.
Yay!
I'm betting it's very similar to the last one. If you can hear a cat, that would be Tigger. I don't know what her problem is.
Go find some place to go to sleep. Go on. Go take a nap.
I think I'm okay with that. It's got some floral notes. It's got a little bit of tannic quality to it. Got a pretty decent acidic profile to it, which is really surprising. Actually, that's what I want to do. Let's get a pH reading real quick.
You got it.
All right, so if you're curious why I'm going to take a pH reading, it's just because I'm curious. That's the only real reason. There's no actual necessity for one at this time, but it tastes acidic enough to me that I kind of wanted to get an idea of just how acidic it is. And right now, it's sitting pretty acidic. It's about 3.0, somewhere between 2.5 and 3.0 pH. So that's also very good for preservation and stability. That means that things aren't likely to be able to grow in it. A lot of microorganisms and things like that that usually like higher pH are not going to be able to grow. That's a good thing for preservation.
It's also my understanding that the higher acidity or the lower pH, it's the same thing, is going to help maintain the protein molecules within the beverage so it's not going to break down. That's my understanding. I may be wrong, but in my research, that's what it said.
Okay, so the next step for this, we're going to rack it back into a regular fermenter, much like the one it came out of, because we have just about 128 ounces.
Question.
What?
Did we take a final gravity reading after we sweetened it?
We did not. Let's do that
first.
right now. That's why there's two of us, you know? Sometimes you forget. Because here's the thing. Because we sweeten to taste, the actual volume isn't known. Yes, I know we could put it on a scale and do it all that way, but the actual volume that we use doesn't really matter, because if you had 90 ounces or 110 ounces or 130 ounces, you have a different number than we do. So adding the exact same volume of honey that we did really doesn't make much sense. Now, someone said, they corrected one of my statements. I said that if you add the same amount of gravity that we did in ours, you'd have the same thing. I misspoke. It's not the same thing. You would have the same effective sweetness as ours. So no, it's not the same thing, because of course you'd have a little bit different. Like, their point was that if it had stopped at say 1.010 and ours stopped at 0.990 and we both sweetened to 1.020, that we don't have the same thing. They are correct. However, that's not really what we talk about. We talk about if you end it dry and you sweeten to about the same range as us, you should have roughly the same thing as we do. A point or two of alcohol isn't going to be all that noticeable, but the sweetness level would be perceptible, and that's the point.
That said, we still suggest that you sweeten it to your desired level, not ours.
If you don't know what sweetness level you like, do it like we did. Sweeten it a little bit at a time. Just add like a quarter pound of honey at a time and keep sweetening it, taste it as you go. When you like it, that's when you stop. Or if you want to add just a little bit more like we did, you know, that tablespoon didn't do anything, I'll just be honest. But, you know, you can add a little bit more until you get it to exactly where you like it. Just remember, it will mellow over time, so the apparent sweetness will be sweeter over time than it is in the very beginning. And we actually sweeten this to 1.024. So 1.024 makes this sweet. It's a sweet mead. It's not as sweet as I thought it might be. I said we were probably going to go to like 1030. We didn't. So that's fine. The next step on this, though, is, like I started to say, we are going to put this into a fermenter again. We have about 124 ounces, so it's just going to be another narrow mouth 1 gallon fermenter, and we are going to pasteurize this. We have a video on how we pasteurize. We use an immersion circulator, also known as a sous vide, which is actually the method, not the equipment, but whatever. And what we do is we bring the whole thing, the internal temperature of that fermenter, up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd think I'd know the Celsius by now, but I'll put it right here. And we keep it at that temperature for 22 minutes. That's important. I hear a lot of people, oh, I just do it for like 10 or 15 minutes. How come I have bubbles? Well, because you didn't actually pasteurize and it's still fermenting. It's very important. Pasteurization is a scientific thing. You have to do it that long at that temperature to kill the yeast. There are many temperatures and times that you can use. 140 at 22 minutes is the one that we use, and it seems to be the most reliable, does the least damage to your brew itself, and seems to be safe enough on the vessel that you're pasteurizing it in. We've not had a vessel crack from pasteurizing, other than we had a couple of bottle caps blow off when we happened to do it in a bottle. So it's pretty safe. We've done it hundreds of times. Never really had a problem at all. So that's another thing a lot of people are very afraid to pasteurize. Don't be. It's like so safe. It's crazy.
The reason why we're pasteurizing is because we added a fermentable sugar, the honey. And so we don't have any way of knowing whether our yeast are going to ferment that more. So that way we're pasteurizing to make sure we kill off those yeasts and we have a controlled beverage.
Now, you're saying that, and somebody's going to ask, because it's true. This ended at 1.002, not 1.000 or below. But here's something, and this is an idea that I've had for a while that I'm trying to get across. 1.000 is just an indiscriminate number. It is not actually done. It is not actually dry. Because if you take a 10% solution of ethanol and water, ethanol is 0.790 gravity, water is 1.000 gravity. So a 10% solution or a 10% ABV would actually be 0.7. Hold on, I got to do math now. See, my brain's not working right. 0.790 plus 9 for 9 times 1.000 would be 9.79 divided by 10 gives us 0.979 final gravity. Now, I don't even think this goes to that. No, 0.990 is as low as ours goes. Actually, I could probably get 0.980 out of it. So that right there tells me that anything that isn't that number on a 10% alcohol means it's not actually dry. Now, that's not to scare anybody or freak anybody out. It's just saying that 1.000 does not actually mean done. It doesn't actually mean dry. 994, 996, they don't mean done or dry. They're just a number, okay? The yeast will go to what the yeast will go to. The trick is get that reading twice over a 1 or 2 week period. Then you know it's stable. Now, the Cote de Blanc yeast, what does that do? I don't know. I have to look it up. This is exactly how I find this stuff out. Cote de Blanc yeast tolerance, alcohol tolerance. It's 12 to 14%. Like we said, we're right in that 12 to 14% range. So is it possible this won't ferment more? Yes. Is it possible it could? Yes. Now, there's a couple ways to approach it. We're going to pasteurize, but we could let it sit, see if it ferments, and if it does, just keep adding honey until it stops. If you want to do that, you totally can. It's just going to take a lot longer, and you're going to need more time to let it sit in between, making sure that it's not fermenting.
Also, if you use that method, please keep it under airlock and don't seal it.
Absolutely.
Or you're going to have problems if it does ferment.
Yeah, because you're basically still fermenting it. So we actually like it the way it is. We don't want more alcohol. We want it to be where it is. So that's why we are going to pasteurize. If none of that makes sense, please ask in the comments below so I can explain it a little bit further. To me, that's a major safety concern, and it is a huge thing that a lot of people ask questions about. So I don't want anyone to get confused or feel afraid or anything like that. We are so used to pasteurizing that it's second nature. We just, okay, this could re-ferment. We're going to pasteurize. Done. As far as flavor change, somebody's going to ask that too. We did a video on this. The flavor change is so minimal as to not really even be a problem. If you tasted this now and tasted it after pasteurization in a couple hours, you would be hard pressed to tell much of a difference. Side by side, very slight changes. That's why we like the 140 degree temperature. When you go higher in temperature or longer in time than the 22 minutes, that's when you start to have some flavor changes that may or may not be good. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not. And I've babbled for far too long, so we're going to pasteurize this now. And that means we'll see you in a few days to a week to give a final tasting.
Okay, so it's been 5 days. Now it's time for our final test.
Now, this was pasteurized. As we said, it's important to pasteurize if you do add more fermentables to something that could actually keep fermenting.
Now, you may, from your point of view, I don't know for sure, see some floaties in there. That's because we were less than gentle in our transference from the fermentation station to here.
Yep, it happens sometimes.
And so we jostled.
Ideally, you don't want to have to move things, but, you know, we have one studio.
You gotta move stuff.
I said ideally.
Well,
in a perfect world. But let me show you what we mean by that. So as you look inside the container, you can see little tiny bits in there. Those are just little tiny pieces of lees that are up in suspension. Most of them will fall out over time. It's not anything to worry about. Could you use some sort of a clearing agent if you want to? Of course you can, but we are starting to back away from those because, well, in a test, they actually took away some flavors. And what's the point in going through all this trouble if you're going to take away the flavors anyway, just to make it look clear? Because let's just be honest. That is pretty sparkling, clear, and clean. Let's do the white paper test.
Let's.
So, looking at it, I mean, that's up against the white paper. It's not exactly up against the white paper. There we go. Now it is. That is pretty crystal clear. I can't imagine it being much clearer than that, to be honest with you. So the tiny floater bits, I'm just not going to worry about it.
Yeah, another thing of why it might be such a large particulate that's floating in there is we find often with pasteurization, it helps...
It'll clump it.
Yeah, it kind of works like a clearings adjacent, sort of.
Sometimes, not
really.
Always. It's unpredictable as to whether it's going to help clear
and
or
I hate
not.
saying things like that because people then immediately assume that is every scenario this is going to happen. And I don't think there's anything in every scenario in homebrew that is absolutely going to happen this way.
No. We are not Sith.
So we are not dealing in absolutes here, ladies and gentlemen.
There's very little absolutes. It's always it depends and an if-then clause.
Yeah.
Pretty much. But anyway. On the smell, it still smells really young to me. It smells...
I'm almost getting an apple-y aroma.
Yeah, like a green apple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is not offensive at all. It's actually...
It could be the honey.
Nice.
It's a wildflower honey, so it could be from any number of things.
Yep.
It's not bad. It smells better now than I remember it.
And the color in the glass is really quite
It's actually
lovely.
really pretty.
Yeah.
Very clear.
Yep.
And I'm going in for a taste. Okay. This is significantly better than before. Mm-hmm. I remember last week, it was a little harsh. It was a little rough. It was almost unpleasant.
Yeah.
Now, it's melded a bit more.
Yep.
I want to think it's just the 5 days, but I don't think it is. I'm pretty sure the pasteurization helped mellow some of those flavors.
Yep.
And I know people always get crazy when we say that, but it does sometimes. It really does. It just rounds things off a little bit, makes it a little mellower. I don't like to say it's like it aged it, but...
Because it doesn't. Only time
it doesn't age it, but it mellows those flavors similar to what the aging process does. That's the best way I can say it.
And you may hear us say lots of times adjacent or similar to or other verbiage such as that. And that's because, again, we're not Sith. We're not dealing in absolutes. And we're just trying to convey to you something that you might be able to understand and associate with something that's known for you. And that's one of our difficulties, I think, as a YouTube educator, is that we have this distance between us and you.
Yeah, it's at least like 4 feet.
So we're doing our best to try to express the process and the tools and the sensations. And so that's why sometimes we get a little verbose and start babbling.
Yeah.
It's not because we like to hear ourselves talk. Actually, I enjoyed the silence. Thank you very much.
She does.
But we want to give you as much information as possible to help you on your homebrew journey.
Right.
I am loving this right now for 2 reasons.
I like it. Go ahead.
Reason number 1, and I've mentioned this a lot of time in our tastings, is not the flavor so much, but as the tactile experience. Oh, yeah. This has got a lovely, creamy
rich
mouthfeel.
Velvety.
That I really enjoy in meads because it gives the tactile sensation of honey, which I appreciate.
Mm-hmm. You know, we're going to need more. Did you get the...
I put the baster away.
Yeah.
It's the downfall of attempting to be tidy.
You can never have just one glass for a tasting. I mean, you can. It's just, how much are you really getting from like 3 sips, you know? I was going to wait till we were actually empty, but okay.
I'm still
I know.
halfway.
You're going to get more.
The color is lovely.
Yeah.
I really am enjoying that color.
The color and clarity on this are fantastic. Now, this took a grand total of, it's about 6 weeks from start to drinking. 6 weeks sounds really, really fast to some people when it comes to mead, because there's this idea that it has to age for years and years and years. Not necessarily. It really depends on what you made.
Right. There are some meads that, yes, they definitely need that extended aging period in order for all of their just separate notes to meld and come together. And then there's many, particularly the style that we tend to brew, that don't necessarily need that much time.
Now, time for aging depends on many factors, but a major factor is actually the ABV. And we hear all the time a lot of people that are trying for like 18 and 20% ABV, and then they don't understand why it doesn't taste good at 4 or 6 weeks like ours do. It's because we don't shoot for astronomical ABVs. Like this one, for example, is roughly 13%, somewhere in that range. That's a pretty decent range for most wines and meads that doesn't need a ton of aging to taste good. There's no definitive how long per ABV. Just the general rule of thumb is the higher the ABV, the more aging necessary, because you have a lot more harsh flavors that need to mellow and combine. So by keeping that down a little bit and just kind of playing with those numbers, like everybody has their sweet spot. Some people prefer 15%, some people prefer more like 10%.
We're normally in the 12-ish.
12 to 13 seems to fit our taste just nice. Sometimes we go 15 if it's something that is intended to be really sweet or very richly flavored. You can get away with it because that'll mask more of the ethanol. But something that's very, very simple and doesn't have a lot added to it, like something like this, notice how sweet we went. We went to 1.024 because there was some harsher notes that needed to be masked, and some of that comes from the ethanol. So would this have been better if we only went to, say, 10%? Maybe. Maybe. And that is something that we've experimented with here and there. It might have actually been a little bit more pleasing at that ABV rather than at 13. Would it be a huge difference? I don't think so. I don't think 2 or 3% would have made that much difference.
All right. So the flavor profile,
very floral.
Very floral. I want to think I'm still getting a little bit of a nod to a fruit, whether it's
I can't say
apple
what it is.
or pear, something very neutral.
Pear. It's pear.
Yeah. But it's just a little slight little, think about pear, kind of thing. It's not like pear. But I'm finding that combination with the floral notes to be really pleasing.
It is. I would swear this was a flavored mead, not just a traditional. It has that much extra kind of going for it. It's really surprising. It's kind of got a little tanginess to it even that I can't explain where it all came from. Must be the honey. Now, we use Cote de Blanc yeast, which is known for like fruitiness and things like that. It's a pretty good all-around standard yeast. We added wine tannin, fermento, and honey. That's it.
There is a possibility that we're getting a little bit of the nuance from the yeast, but I want to stress this right now because I don't want everybody to just jump in their car and zoom out and buy all the Cote de Blanc that they can get. It's a subtle nuance. Yeasts are going to add a subtle nuance to your brew. They're not going to be
in most cases. There are some yeast that can do a very drastic change under certain conditions, but in most conditions.
When you're choosing a yeast for your brew, it's more important to get something that's going to work in the alcohol tolerance range that you're striving for and works in the temperature range that you're fermenting in.
Because that's the huge difference right there.
And the pH. Now, the pH, I think, is far down the line because most yeasts are relatively on the same playing field when it comes to pH.
Okay, I know what you mean.
But the temperature difference we've noticed in our recent visiting with Sharing Days at Fermentis in Belgium, they re-emphasized what we were already experiencing in our own process, that temperature range and the happiness of your yeast are very closely related. Some yeasts are going to work far superior in colder temperatures, which we certainly don't have here in Florida, where other yeasts are going to be just fine and do what they need to do. And that's why we have gravitated to the certain yeasts that we use because we found that they worked in our area.
A little more elaboration on that statement. If you look at most packets of yeast, they say it works great from 55 to 90 degrees. Well, they may work, but they're going to work a little bit differently at 55 than they do at 90. They're going to produce different flavors, different esters. How different are they? That depends on the yeast, but most times it's not a night and day difference. It's a noticeable difference, but it's not like the end of the world. Most times you can overcome it with alterations and final taste adjustments of your meat itself.
All right, we need to pause because I have a cat that's interfering with our process here. 1 moment, please.
Okay, cat problems averted.
He was asleep, he was being a good boy, and then nope, he absolutely was not a good boy anymore.
But back to the yeast thing. This is something that comes up a lot, and I know a lot of people make a big deal about it. Here's the truth of the matter. If you have 100% controllable conditions, and I mean you are using the same must in the same environment with the same water quality, same chemical composition of everything, same honey from the same season, from the same bees, everything is the same, and the only variable is your yeast, you will see some differences. But if you have other variables in there, the differences between the yeast become almost negligible, because a difference of 5 degrees in fermenting temperature is going to mean more than a different yeast in many cases. Again, you can't always or never say something, because some yeast really do. Like a lot of Kveik yeast will give off really unique and exotic esters at certain temperature ranges, but use them in normal temperatures and they don't really do anything any different than any other yeast.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, within that same range, most yeast are going to do mostly the same thing. You might be able to tell the difference if you tasted side by side, but you'd have to do it side by side. Taste one today and one tomorrow, you might not be able to tell the difference.
Yeah.
And to me, it's kind of like when I was a photographer and people would what they call pixel peep. You put something into Photoshop and you bring it up to 500% on the screen and you go, oh, look, I can see a difference. At 500%, is that really a difference? And that's kind of where we're at here.
Yeah.
How far down do you have to dig before you say that's different versus it's roughly the same? Because when we did the ciders, the 3 side by side, honestly, if I threw a pinch of sugar into one of them, it would have made it exactly the same as the other one.
Yeah.
It just, there's almost no real discernible difference because our parameters are so variable. Now, like I say, in a lab, it doesn't even have to be a lab, under very controlled conditions, which maybe some of you are actually doing that. I don't know very many homebrewers that do, but I know some people really do dig down that rabbit hole, and that's cool. I can respect that. It's not something I care to do. Most homebrewers aren't that lab controlled, so the differences become a lot more down to environment, personal taste, and the ingredients put in. I mean, had we used a different kind of honey, this would taste completely different.
Yeah. And for us in conveying information to you, our stress, our emphasis is creating an environment that's going to work.
Yep.
Something that's going to work, that you will be able to replicate, and you'll have a finished beverage that you're going to be happy with, and not be concerned about, is it unsafe? Did it not work? You know, we don't want any frustrations. And so lots of the things that we stress is to make a safe, enjoyable beverage for you to recreate at home,
right,
rather than, oh, it has a slight touch more floral than this one has a slight touch more citrus, but only in this parameter. Because that's just far beyond the scope of our channel. And
it's a good point that you made, though.
And what we want to enable you to do, right? So we're constantly learning, and we're constantly re-evaluating our process. And if you've watched our very beginning videos, bless you for that, but you can see the growth that we've gone as homebrewers ourselves. And it was really exciting, and I know we're babbling, and I'm sorry, but it was really exciting going to the Fermentis sharing days in Belgium, where this huge company basically said, yes, you're doing it right. And these spots that you had a disconnect, well, here's the answer. And it was just like a light bulb moment. And it made me feel really good and justified with the information that we're handing out. But it also was like, oh, that makes sense. Okay, I was on the right path. I just didn't see that connection.
Right.
And one of the connections we found on our own was pH, and how pH can be a big problem and more than likely the cause of most of the stalls we've had in the past. At Fermentis, we found out that temperature is the other variable that may have been causing some of our stalls, because we're here in Florida.
Because we went off, well, the yeast packet says it's good for 50 through 90 degrees.
Yeah, we're in range. We're 70-something because we're in air conditioning. We brew in our house.
But some yeast, just because that's the operating range doesn't mean it's the peak operating range. And that's the key. That's the part that's left out of most of the equation. That somebody's going to ask, how do you know? We only know from experimentation. That's realistically how we know. We experiment with the yeast, we try it. Some of them work in our environment, some of them don't. Like, for instance, Mangrove Jack, MO5. I know people that swear by it. It's the greatest thing ever. Doesn't work for us at all. And other people have told me that live in similar environments to ours, same problem. It doesn't work. EC1118 is another one. We just do not see that as a super yeast.
Yep.
However, 71B will beat out EC1118 in our environment any day of the week.
Which it shouldn't.
And it shouldn't.
So,
but it does.
There you go. Environment is everything. All right, so back to this brew.
Yeah.
Tangents, they're a thing.
I also want to add one more thing that you started to say. Most of the precautions that we give, if you think about it, most of the hard rules that we have are for your own safety and the safety of your brew. Like using star sand, very important. Racking, using an auto siphon to rack, not just pouring, not doing that.
Airlocks.
Using an airlock. Checking your pH now, making sure that it's low enough, not high enough, low enough. Below 4.6 is what we recommend. All those little things are not really to penalize or say, you have to do it this way. There's safety precautions. Without those, you're taking the tethers off and you could run into problems. If you follow all of those rules, the likelihood of a problem is minimized. And that's really the gist of our rules, so to speak.
Yep.
So, yeah. Everything else is up for creativity and do what you want.
Yep. For a base speed, I'm really enjoying this. I think this worked out really well.
It has a lot more layers and complexity than I ever would have thought.
Yep.
For a basic traditional mead.
Yep. I think we've already talked about the notes, the textural, the different nuances.
We've talked about a lot of stuff.
So now it's time for numbers.
Okay. Our scoring system is back to ye olde system, which is to say it's very simple. 1 through 10 with the occasional 11, okay? And I break it into like 3 essential areas. You got like 1 through 4-ish, which is kind of, it's crap. We really didn't like it. And depending on how crappy it is, we might dump it out. We don't often dump things out, but if it's that bad and we need the bottles, we will. If we're not going to drink it, there's no point in keeping it. That brings us to the second phase, which is, it's pretty decent. Anything from like 4 to 7-ish is, yeah, I'd drink it. I'd probably have a second glass if it was offered to me, but I wouldn't necessarily think of that as my first choice. And then we have the 7 and above, all the way to 11, and that's like these are really good, all the way through to the illustrious 11, which is just superb. So anything that's above a 5, basically, is considered pretty good to amazing. That simplifies it as best as I possibly can. That was what, my 2-minute elevator pitch for our rating system now? And we went back to the simple rating system simply because simpler is sometimes better. It comes across better, and we already talked about all the nuance. There's no reason to worry about numbers and scores.
Nope.
Just, we put a number on it. It's kind of like whose line is it anyway?
The scores don't matter.
The scores don't matter, and the points are just made up.
Something like that.
Or the scores are made up and the points just don't matter?
We'll have to get the quote right.
Yeah, I'll have to look it up.
Write it down, because we always mess it up.
It's all right. It's our quote now. We're claiming it.
I love that show, though.
Anyway, I need to finish mine first. All right. So now you know that I had 3 glasses of this already. That tells you something.
It's a good sign.
But does it tell you everything? Not necessarily.
No.
Do you have a score?
I do.
I'm debating between 2. I'll tell you which 2 afterwards, but I think I'm just going to go with my gut for the first one.
All right.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 8.
Booyah!
Yep. My trepidation was 8 to 7.5.
Yeah, me too.
Because this is nice, and I think this has room to grow. I think as it ages, it's going to get even better, richer, smoother. It's going to have that brandy-like quality in a year. I really think it's going to have that very rich in-the-mouth flavor. But right now, it's quite good. I know we've made stuff that's better. There's a couple of notes in there in the 3/4 and like almost in the finish that they're a little more bitter than I really like. But that's also a 6-week-old mead made without a lot of extra ingredients to cover those up or mask it.
Yep. And that's where my terrible 8 comes in, is that I'm a layers girl. I want to have all the flavors all at once. Pow, 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 pow. But
has a lot.
This has a lot going on for a traditional.
Way more than I thought it would.
So I had to give it at least an 8 based on that fact alone. But traditionals really aren't my thing.
Yeah. See, I love traditionals. I like the nuance between the different honeys and just keeping it very, very simple. I actually like the flavor of honey in a mead. I don't like them dry, though. I like them to be sweet.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I really don't enjoy them.
But this granted an 8 for sure, because I can definitely see myself going, oh, yeah, I like that one. Pour me a glass.
Yeah, this would be nice with a meal or even with a dessert or something.
Sure, yeah.
It would be really good. But anyway, do you have anything else to say to this one?
I do not.
All right. Well, as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.
Bye-bye.